good that way. They're speaking to a big lay audience. So the Dalai Lama, that's great, because with the Tibetans, it's a little harder in a sense, because they're so loaded with method that can be a problem for people. And at the same time, if you're sort of beyond method with Dzogchen, people don't understand the profundity of it.
And this was written for people of all faiths to be able
Mm-hmm.
to embrace.
Mm-hmm.
So I just was continuously struck with how profound and yet how accessible.
Yeah.
I just couldn't get over it. It was so skillful,
Yeah. And especially when you have knowledge of or read some of his other books on, the highest tantra or Kala Chakra, you just go, oh my goodness, the knowledge that he has of this, and of course the understanding. That's very encouraging to me when someone it's like a great, I don't know, like a great teacher of tennis or something. Or I actually ran into one great teacher in throwing the discus, if you can believe it or not. Such an interesting guy. He had been friends with this kind of like trio of hammer throwers, like in the 1930s. How esoteric is that? And we were at college, and we had a handful. It was just kind of unusual. We had 4 guys who were really doing very well with the hammer throw and the discus. And lo and behold, but there wasn't a coach. I mean, there was a track coach, but he was the kind of guy that had people running 10 miles every day. And he was fine like that. But when it came to those particular events, and so we were kind of lobbying for it. And lo and behold, they found this guy who had that kind of connections. He was just a wonderful master coach and knew his stuff. But he had a drinking problem, so he kept getting fired from positions all over the place. But they hired him for 1 year for us, and he was living sleeping on a cot in the athletic building on the 3rd floor or something. But he was a genius as far as teaching you how to do things. It was very, very remarkable. But what I'm saying is that sometimes when you have people who have great knowledge, can also put things in a very simple way, and tremendous communicators at the same time. So that's a wonderful thing, and Dalai Lama is sort of beyond as far as an exemplar of that. Yeah. So I'll look for that. Yeah, it's helpful.
Ethics for the millennium.
Yeah.
The journey without a goal.
Yeah. Yeah. I like Trunk for the same reason, because he was so, his English, but more than that, he really got Western culture. And it wasn't like a foreign thing to him, but he didn't lose any of his traditional, so to speak, understanding too. So that's very good. Yeah, no, that's a good suggestion too, Keen. Those are good. His introduction to Francesca Fremantle was one of the translators of what's called the Book of the Dead. And he wrote an introduction to that I just find very, very helpful, because it has more of a psychological approach to it. And he's talking about, these very, even for us, obscure kind of Buddhist deities and that, but he puts them in psychological terms, but with some depth. Again, not with the crudity of this is just desire and this is hatred, that's fine. But he's getting into the attendants, say, to Amitabha, like Mamaki. And why is she white in color? Well, she's white hot. She's burning up. She's burning up this for this. So yeah, you can find the things like that. It's really good to know about one title though, so people don't have to be digging around trying to find something. I don't know. I think I've had kind of I think the greatness of the Dharma is that it turns your shortcomings actually into beneficial things. And my own kind of natural skepticism and stubbornness, arrogance. I mean, like I say, type of person that has to read the entire menu before you have the confidence to make a choice. with that broad kind of reading, you do get a certain kind of education, and that's really good. And then, so when you see something like that, that's very simple and direct. I know we've had people here at the Dharma Center, for instance, who just told me they've been coming for a long time. They've never understood anything I've said.
We get there when you're reading content.
Yeah, right. But I figure, as long as they're sincere, the more you throw against the side of the barn, something sticks. Because truly, that was my introduction to, no, it wasn't my introduction to the Vajrayana, but what struck me very early was Gretchen and I had gone to India, and it had this serendipitous intersection, so to speak, with Vajrayana teachers and one holy shrine of Guru Rinpoche, but didn't really have any kind of emotional reaction to any of it. But when we came back, seeing that video of the Karmapa though doing Chenresig empowerment it turns out to be, I didn't know at the time, but it was a Drikung monastery in Ladakh, which has a Chenresig statue, I found out later, that is maybe one of the oldest ones in existence. It goes back to Nagarjuna, I think. Anyway, that was the first time that it just kind of, I didn't understand, but there was something, the title of it was In the Field of the Senses, and it just didn't, I couldn't relate to it in a Buddhist way, because my thought was just sort of, you just jump outside of all of this stuff to some wonderful realization or Dharmakaya. I didn't even know the term Dharmakaya, but it was the idea of more like here in the Buddha, just trying to escape from everything. And you think there's going to be some sort of something there if you can, but you're rejecting, basically rejecting appearances, phenomenon. You're rejecting in that way sentient beings. And that is the completely upside down realization of the Mahayana, that it's about sentient beings. They're the people that are causing me all my troubles. And my life would be smooth though I didn't have to rub up against these sentient beings. You're disturbing my meditation.
That's the reason why we started coming here. Because we were reading these books, I think the history of the 14 Dalai Lamas.
Yeah.
And then I think we got to my words of my perfect teacher.
Words of my perfect teacher.
And he was talking about, well, there's lots of nightstand Buddhists out there. You're not getting it if you don't have the last thing, which is the Sangha and everybody rubbing elbows.
Yeah, right. So for me, because I had that experience of being bewildered about it, and looking back, that was a very positive moment and led to some very positive things. So I feel encouraged when other people are bewildered because there's something deeper in each one of us going on. It's not that somehow your true nature has to get the approval of your conceptual mind and all your attachments and opinions and concepts. It's something much deeper. Yeah. Okay. So yes, we in the book we've gone through Buddha's life in the palace. We've gone through his renunciation. We've gone through his practicing with the greatest teachers of his time and the limitations thereof, and how he rejected those teachings as not sufficient, and then undertook this radical ascetic path. And so that leads us to page 48, the middle path, which of course is his discovery of the Dharma. And I should say too, those previous sections, I found especially enlightening, good to read them over again. Because when he's talking about here the greatest teachers in India of his day, first of all, he's not talking about modern Hinduism, so that's a mistake that people can make. Hinduism was greatly reformed by, I think his name was Shankara. He was a great reformer in the maybe about 500, 5th century, 6th century, I'm not exactly sure, but somewhere in there. In fact, the most direct descendant from his teachings, I think, are called the non-dual Shaivites, worshippers of Shiva. But Shankar himself was criticized by other Indian teachers of his day as being a crypto-Buddhist. So his teachings are very Buddhistic, according to the Buddhists. But we're going back now 1,000 years before that. And the teaching that we went through here was so fascinating to me because it's very much about the four immeasurables. That's what it's about, and the four stages of Brahma. The highest samsaric states of existence, and the mind states that create that. So again, limitless. Here we go for the four immeasurables. I mean, Buddha put them in terms of. Brought them right back down to earth, which of course is the Mahayana. Again, limitless love, wanting other beings to be happy, limitless compassion, a step subtler, sympathetic joy at the great virtues of the bodhisattvas, and then finally, great impartiality or equanimity. Now, when the Tibetans teach that, they start out with equanimity and impartiality, because only then do those others make great sense. Because if you start out teaching on love, ordinary people think, well, I love my family, I love the people I love. those other guys, can we get rid of them? So you got to start out with the equanimity for teaching purposes. But in terms of the hierarchy of the subtlety of the mind, or the depths of the mind, or the hierarchy of reality, love, compassion, sympathetic joy, and then equanimity. That's such a helpful thing to know too, because there's just so much of what passes for equanimity in our world is basically indifference. And then people can make that into a virtue. There are many people like that think, well, I'm not affected by this, and they think they're kind of superior, therefore. But if it's just indifference, it's not it. But these correspond to the four stations of Brahma. So the highest mental states that are samsaric, that are unenlightened. And the first one is endless space. So if you were stable in this mindset of endless space, that's what all you were aware of, is just the spaciousness of everything. That corresponds to this limitless love. It gives you a sense for when the Buddhists say love, how powerful that is. And again, extensive. I mean, that's the mindset that is limitless love, is space. And then the next one up is consciousness. You're just conscious of consciousness. No sense of self, although there's still attachment there, but it's very subtle and buried. So then this state of just the limitlessness of consciousness. And then the one above that is emptiness, but not the spiritual emptiness with a small e. Just meaning that you're sort of aware of the nothingness, that's all. You're aware that you're aware of nothing, like that. And then the highest samsaric state, this great equanimity, as the Buddha called it, is the state of neither perception nor non-perception, which again is a little nudge more subtle than just nothingness. So the Buddha attained to the highest state, and the one below, the emptiness, and then the one above it, neither perception nor non-perception. And at that realization, the respective teachers said, why don't you take over my students and you can be my successor and keep this lineage going? And he said no, because that wasn't the answer that he was seeking. So the discussion that goes on in this book, I mean, this man's an academic, Michael Carrithers, but I thought it was really wonderful, because you see the courage of the Buddha. I mean, to have that kind of meditational ability obviously means great merit from previous lifetime. but to be able to never rest in some sort of, conceptual or even just experiential state, but going beyond to the great emptiness, we might say. Rather remarkable. But the statement in here, he also has an interaction with one of these wandering ascetics of the time, talking about the self with a capital S, because that was the fundamental belief of in India at his time, was the Atman, this eternal self. That's what we were trying to realize. And that the eternal self was the same as the little self. That was their basic belief. And the Buddha came to the conclusion, and in these interactions with wandering ascetic, preserved in writing, that this self, it's this ultimate self, was still a conditioned thing, was still something that was like created, you might say. It wasn't the ultimate in that way. So, I mean, again, the courage, think of him living in this palace, and I mean, just everything, he was like, he had all the talents, he had good looks, he had the reputation, he had wealth, he had everything. He was like, Hollywood and Genghis Khan together. I don't know, just the peak of kind of worldly situation. And he rejected that. That's just amazing to me, the courage. We see it in our own lives. If you just try to change some habit you have, or step out into a new endeavor or a new way, or whatever, the inertia. But even more so here, because you're going against the views of your whole society. I mean, again, we've talked a little bit about the four castes in India, and at this time they were definitely there. These are ancient institutions. But the warrior caste, of which he was, that was your like sacred role to support the kingdom and do what you had to do, no matter whether it was a great kingdom or some people think it was more like a republic with different family groups kind of ruling it together as an oligarchy. But regardless, he still had that obligation. Dharma means obligation, one of the meanings of Dharma. I mean, duty, law, all these heavy kind of things. And so for him to reject that, it's just hard to imagine, especially because he wasn't on some sort of an ego trip. I mean, there are all sorts of people who just say, well, I'm just checking out. But what my point is that in India at the time, this was like unheard of, really. There were wandering ascetics, but I don't think they were in a situation as a king with those kinds of responsibilities.
So does this give you more of a sense of, what's the right word? Not belief, but that this is karma, like to make that giant leap, just from the shock of seeing things that you didn't see every day and being sort of horrified by the finality and universality of it, that his karma is what really allowed him to change.
Yeah, it brought him to that point, and also gave him the internal power,
the desire
to do that. Yeah. Oh, pass the mic forward. Yeah. Also, his great honesty. I mean, you can see things, that are wrong, or even that you think you should do or have to do, but you don't do it. And for him that somehow to do it so fluidly, I mean, it wasn't like there was some sort of wobbling, going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And of course, the mythic story of the Buddha in his life immediately before taking birth as Gautama, it was Vesantara. And Vesantara goes through this incredible experience of being wrongly, was also some sort of a prince, if I remember correctly, but was attacked and betrayed and really got a raw deal for something, and he and his family were exiled. And he went through this process of just giving beyond giving, where he just gave everything away. And again, in the face of tremendous criticism, he ended up giving away his family. But there's some interesting parallels. I'll get more about that for next time, because this it's actually the professor in whose class I got a C- as I took this book on Buddhism. And then years later, in a personal crisis, discovered the book and read it again, but this time with some interest. Is a beautiful man, and he died just a few years ago. And he has a whole thing about Vesantara that Megan gave me a book last year for Christmas. First time I had heard about this. So I'll get that, because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about. But at any rate, that kind of courage. And so what does he do? He goes forward, great renunciation. There he is with these great teachers of his time. Same thing. He just easily renounces them. He didn't renounce them in the sense that you're wrong, because he later incorporated, but he transformed the teachings that were helpful of his time, but then came up with all sorts of new teachings too. So from there to the great ascetic path. And it's said that he later said that no one had been more rigorous, I guess, in his ascetic practice than he had. And there too, he finally has this insight that this isn't the way, and at that moment discovered the middle way. And what did he do? He didn't renounce them, but his 5 students renounced him because he wasn't doing what they thought was the sacred path. So that takes us to page 48, but I just encourage people to read that over again, because I think the previous pages were very helpful to this kind of understanding. And every time Sunday morning, and I see those 4 immeasurables, it's just 4 little lines that we read, but all of this is behind it. Okay, so page 48, the middle path. In the traditional narrative, this conclusion, and what's the conclusion? The paragraph before, but he also came to the conclusion that by these grueling exertions, the ascetic path, I have by no means gone beyond the common human condition to an eminence of knowledge and vision appropriate to those who are truly spiritually noble. Or in other words, all he had to show for it was a prominent rib cage. There must be another path to wisdom. All right, so the middle path. In the traditional narrative, this conclusion brought the Buddha to the threshold of awakening, but it also brings us to substantial difficulties in the interpretation of the sources. For on the one hand, the Buddha is represented in the narrative as having reached, in a relatively short time, the saving knowledge, the certainty that birth is exhausted, the ascetic's life has been consummated, what was to be done has been done. Indeed, the awakening is meant to have taken place within one night. However, it is already clear that the Buddha's progress towards awakening was long and complex, a process in which he gradually transformed himself by various disciplines and worked out an acceptable view of himself and the world. This was recognized in later discourses. Quote, just as the ocean slopes gradually, falls away gradually, shelves gradually, with no sudden drop, so in this teaching, the training, the practice, the path are gradual, with no sudden penetration of knowledge. Unquote. So how are we to resolve this contradiction? In the first place, we must accept that the purely biographical narratives are compressed accounts. They are stories, and they are stories which march at a smart pace. Their material was meant not only to be historical, but to be an inspiration to later disciples. So they were fitted into a relatively manageable span. They had dramatic tension, hence, even if we accept that the awakening, as a moment of certainty in the Buddha's mind, that he was indeed on the right path, did take place in a single night, that certainty was long in the making and longer in the elaboration of its implications. In the traditional account, the Buddha, realizing the pointlessness of extreme asceticism accepted a reasonable meal, and sat down to find that the other path, that other path, sorry. In effect, that is, he accepted a still relatively disciplined asceticism, but one which avoided extremes of sensual indulgence or of self-mortification. He was soon to designate this more measured asceticism the middle path. He also recollected a time when, as a child, he had sat under a rose-apple tree while his father had worked in the fields. He had on that occasion entered the first absorption, accompanied with casual and applied thought, and with bodily happiness and the mental pleasure born of seclusion. And he recognized that this might well be the way to awakening. No, the absorptions are called the dhyanas. I think the four immeasurables are the last four. There are 8, I think, dhyanas, but I could be wrong on that. This account alludes only indirectly to the Buddha's original meditative accomplishments before the awakening. These accomplishments were composed, on the one hand, of his already established habit of meditative pragmatism, of his concentration upon what he could witness by and within himself, and on the other, of his now hardened inclination to analysis and criticism. For despite his rejection of the yogi's doctrine, he continued to cultivate the awareness of mental and physical states, an awareness which had risen out of the yogi's psychic technology. If it was impossible to find an enduring entity, a self with a capital S, through and behind these mutable experiences, it was possible at least to have an insight into the nature of these evanescent psychophysical processes themselves. Here were matters which could be directly witnessed and directly understood, and it was upon these processes that the Buddha turned the full weight of his concentration and driving curiosity. For if he could not find a self, he could at least find release. What these efforts gave rise to was a distinguishable meditative skill, quite different from that practiced by other yogis. For this concern with immediate experience required not only a power of concentration, but also a kind of mindfulness and self-possession through which the Buddha could in fact see what was going on in his mind and body. Indeed, it was just these qualities, mindfulness and self-possession, and then he puts the Pali in here, sati sampanjnana, jhana, which mindfulness and self-possession, which were to be taught throughout the Buddha's mature discourses. They demanded the ability to witness here and now with full lucidity the inner and outer states of oneself, and by extension, the analogous experiences of others. The single most important text for the training of his own disciples was to be the great discourse on the foundations of mindfulness. And that's the title of the text. And these foundations are the dispassionate, immediate, and clear perceptions of the meditator's own body, feelings, state of mind, and mental contents. So when we started Lama Mipam in our last meditative weekend, this is where he started. He was putting a connection between these four pillars of mindfulness and Mahamudra, which was rather remarkable. But nonetheless, such alert perceptions presuppose to an extent the one-pointedness and equanimity of the absorptions, but they required at the same time a bright awareness of the smallest perception. This emphasis on and elaboration of wakeful and energetic introspection constituted the Buddha's unique contribution to meditative technology. From the conclusions based on this introspection, the awakening was to flow. So this is very interesting here, I think. you know, alert perceptions presupposed the one-pointedness and equanimity of the absorptions of the meditations, but they required at the same time a bright awareness of the smallest perception. So this is what truly is the middle way. This there's no distinction. Well, I mean, there's distinctions, but at the same time, they're not radically different. You have this vast view, and yet this detail. So this scholar is saying this was his contribution to meditative technology. And we see it symbolized in Guru Rinpoche. You know, when you see the pictures of Guru Rinpoche, the Tankas, you know, he's got his hat on and he's got a feather coming out. It's a vulture feather coming out of the top of his head. And why? Because the vulture flies the highest. He has the highest view. And yet they said of Guru Rinpoche that he has his view is the vastness, and yet his action is as fine as flower. So this is what's, I mean, again, the complete comprehension, the complete inclusiveness, you might say, of everything, but in this detail. So this is where, for instance, with compassion, yes, there's this vast view of lifetimes after lifetimes after lifetimes, and the infinity, so to speak, of compassion. You know, the removing from suffering of all sentient beings. I mean, wow. But at the same time, what does that mean? The smallest thing. You know, the Buddha shared his lunch with the sparrows that would come. And this is what we see, this kind of alienation or not understanding in the modern world so much. Because often the people who are talking about, well, everything's so upside down. You know, world peace, I love everybody, but they hate their neighbor. and they hate themselves in many ways. And so it's this seeing, it's almost like that verse from William Blake, you know, to see infinity in a grain of sand. It's that kind of idea where, but it's just right there, because what is real compassion? Well, it has to be right here, right now. It has to be something that you're doing right now, not just some mental concept. The concepts might be fine, don't get me wrong, but concepts just divorced from what we do. Anyway, it's a radical teaching. And it was from these conclusions, based on this introspection, the awakening was to flow. So the way to awakening is to practice awakening. That's what it comes down to. And the incredibly blessed thing is when people actually have confidence in the methods. Because in a sense, they've seen the ultimate result. And then there's this desire to save all sentient beings, but even short of that, to save myself. At least that's getting you on the path. But there's this confidence, and that confidence, that faith, you know, is akin to, it is actually the true nature shining even through our ordinary consciousness. But, you know, this is not something that people necessarily even understand, even when they're hit with it. So it's an especially all of this stuff, these temples, you know, the Buddha statues, all the stuff, the lineages, you know, all of it is just simply to allow people to practice their true nature, even though they don't know that's what it is. And of course, if you abide in the true nature, even in a relative sense, more and more it is like shining. Yeah, can't use the, yeah, yeah.
I've been doing chairs, and I'm like, so I think you've taught us before that we use concepts to get beyond concepts.
Yeah, that's the genius of it. It's not rejecting concepts. It's not rejecting sentient beings. How do you liberate sentient beings unless you're involved with sentient beings? Yeah. Okay. How can one treat objectively and analyze one's own immediate feelings and attitudes? Would not the effort to perceive passions dispassionately, for example, destroy the object of study itself? The answer to these questions lies in the course of training to which the Buddha had already subjected himself, albeit unsystematically, in his search. In the pursuit of both meditative accomplishment and the asceticism, the Buddha had repeatedly disciplined himself to ignore those sensations and impulses which ordinarily issue in action or reaction, and which would thereby have deflected him from his purpose. He had ignored the calls of hunger and thirst which accompanied his fast, as he had ignored those pains of the body and distractions of the mind which accompany long and arduous meditation. The effect of such long discipline, as meditators today attest, is not only to achieve a reproducible tranquility, but also to break long-standing, automatic, and unconscious habits. One would ordinarily break a fast to eat, but the ascetic does not. One would ordinarily shift from a physical position which grows increasingly uncomfortable, but the meditator does not. To get the measure of this meditation, try this experiment. Sit in the most comfortable possible position in a comfortable chair, and try to hold that position without moving for an hour. The Buddhist prediction is that within minutes you will wish to scratch the nose, twitch the finger, shift the leg. What if one could watch these urges arise and pass away with no movement at all? But this is not to say that impulses to respond to such calls disappear, for they do not, or at least not permanently. In the meditator, such impulses simply do not issue in a reaction. He is tranquil. His mind is malleable. He can temporarily ignore such impulses completely if he chooses, as in an absorption in the jhanas. But his long-term relationship to such impulses is also changed, for he can now respond to such impulses in a reasoned rather than an automatic way. And so this is the increase in freedom. Instead of being chained by all our arisings in the mind, suddenly we're able to see their arisings, recognize them for what they are, and therefore not be kicked around by them. It's so simple and direct, and yet takes training, because all of us, we start to meditate, and boy, it is really true. There's like a tsunami of thoughts. And the greatness is that, people sometimes discourage themselves because they have all these thoughts, but they're seeing them. That's what it's all about. That is wonderful, because ordinarily we're walking around, we don't see the tsunami effect of them. The stronger ones, sure we do. But all of these things, then they're like lurking there. And so it's kind of like on a fast, you fast and suddenly your taste becomes more sensitive, and you're aware of all of these things, and you're aware of all the time that you spend just time-wise feeding our face. So it's like a mental fast. And we're seeing the benefits from that. And there's benefit in just doing that. And so I remember when I first started meditating for 5 minutes, it was like torment for me. There's kind of a curiosity, but then rapidly that just turned into boredom, and it was just pure torment. But somehow, you think, well, there's something beneficial here. But it wasn't until later that I realized even that very process, the process itself is practice, is the Dharma. And you're burning through stuff also. So it's like this amazing discovery that he made, being able to ignore the sensations in that. And of course, when you agree to sit down for 5 minutes and then you time yourself or whatever, and especially when you're like in a temple here with other people in a collective kind of situation, there's a natural kind of strengthening of our desire to at least not embarrass ourselves and run up screaming out of the room in the midst of the meditation session. So somehow with that, that societal, that friendly support, it allows us to persist a little bit more than we would. And of course, we learn, therefore, from that persistence. I think people have had the experience where you can be, I don't know, even like meditating for a day, for instance, and you got some recurrent thought like, oh, I got to do this. I got to change my plane reservation when I get out of here. I did the wrong thing. Blah 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 blah. It's just like totally absorbing you. And then when the retreat is over, you got plenty of time to do it, but you're not even thinking about it anymore. I mean, it's a wonderful thing. You see how these things are just, we're just beaten up by our thoughts all the time. But the necessity of that discipline, you see it in perspective, how strong it was. And yet, when the retreat was over, you felt this kind of freedom and more spaciousness. And yes, you dealt with it just perfectly, but you weren't compelled to deal with it. You were just doing what had to be done. So things are seen in a different perspective. And in a sense, nothing's different. But in another way, everything is different with practice. Moreover, just because such sensations and impulses do not disappear, he can choose to exercise mindfulness, securely founded in his now habitual equanimity, to observe and analyze them. Whereas the ordinary, unskilled person can with clarity contemplate painful or pleasurable sensations and the accompanying impulses and emotions only in the tranquility of memory, safely removed from their effects by time, the meditator learns to do so immediately as they actually occur. It must be the case that because of his long training, the meditating ascetic perceives his pains, pleasures, and urges as being less poignant and pressing, but this does not change their fundamental nature. And in any case, the meditator may still use memory and the observation of other people to confirm that what he observes of his relatively controlled emotions must also be true of less controlled emotions. This new form of meditation was to be called insight, vipassana meditation. It was the Buddha's experimental method, his way of gathering information, and upon this information about his presently occurring states of body and mind, his analysis of the human condition was to be erected. Yeah. True seeing is the translation of vipassana in Tibetan Latong. So he's referring here to the practices of the four mindfulnesses. With the Mahayana, the meaning of vipassana, although the fundamental meaning is there, but it's expanded into a whole range of practices, you might say. But certainly it's the idea of using the calm mind, the calmer mind, to look at our mind, and results in seeing the nature of the mind itself. So again, the example you've heard me give so many times is that this any kind of concentration practice. I mean, it can be reading sutras in a concentrated way. It can be being mindful of what you're doing during the day instead of distracted. But it can be obviously focusing on an object of meditation. That can be a physical object like a stone or a Buddha figure. It can be the breath. It can be the visualized mandala. I mean, that's harder obviously because it's so vast, and you're like using the mind itself as the object of meditation. So it gets rather subtle. But nonetheless, that concentrative aspect is the shamatha. That is the calming the mind meditation. And the example that's used is a lake or a body of water, and normally our thoughts and experiences are chopping up. They're like winds that chop up the surface. And so because of that, the full moon is out there shining, but we don't see it. What we see are the fractured aspects of the light of the full moon on the surface of our mind, the surface of that lake. So with concentration practice, those waves calm down. And with perfection, that body of water, our mind, becomes like a perfect mirror. And so what do we see? We see the full moon reflected perfectly in that surface. So that is Vipassana, is we're looking at that image of the moon. It's still not the moon itself, it's the reflected image, but now we're seeing it clearly. So that is true seeing. And then Vipassana, again, in the Mahayana, goes further and further and further until you basically become the moon. But you see how powerful that is, because instead of the normal just confusion and distraction and agitation and all the stuff that's going on, but by this concentrative practice, which actually has Vipassana mixed in with it too, because as you see all the agitations in that, you recognize them now as agitations, as something that is kind of goofing up your true vision. So that's why the teachings are so important too, because we have a conceptual idea of what we're doing here instead of just mindlessly doing it. But it can happen that people don't know, and still they get the benefits, and it's like they say, a gradual path. So that's Vipassana. And the entire Buddhist path is nothing other than the practice of shamatha, calming the mind, tranquility, and Vipassana, applying the calm mind, more powerful mind, so to speak, onto the nature of your mind, the nature of the arisings, how they function, how they distract, everything. It's said sometimes it's like this concentration practice is like a lens. You have all these rays of the sun, which of course are just infinite and all over the place. But this practice is like holding up a lens, and so you're able to concentrate all this distraction into one point, and therefore light a fire. And that fire is wisdom. That fire is Vipassana. So these are these wonderful images that we've been taught, which I think help out of this wild, this wild mind that we see when we sit down to meditate. I love the phrase in the Vajrakalaya text, that I may go across the abyss of meditation. It's just something that's so wonderful and honest about that. I mean, there can be blissful things in meditation, of course, but the popular understanding of meditation, which I seem to run into all the time, I don't know why, people have an idea of just blissfulness and kind of like an escape or something, but at any rate, something easy. And I used to think I was doing something wrong because this is not easy. My first yamataka. I mean, it's just after years of meditation, it was like, had I done anything? It was like just a torrent of strong, gripping thoughts that you couldn't ignore. I found myself writing them down, trying to make them just not have the weight that they had, fooling myself that, after the retreat, maybe I can deal with this or something. And then it can come in even, more seductive kind of ways, like this is maybe some sort of insight into your relationships, or even an insight into Dharma teachings in that. I mean, some of these things are valid and good because they can increase your confidence, and at least you're burning through something. But at the other time, a lot of these things are just the subtle kind of distractions that we do to ourselves. That's what's so interesting. There's no demon that's doing this to us. We're doing it to ourselves. And the great thing is that therefore we can undo it. Okay, where are we? We still have a couple of minutes. We are at the Awakening, chapter 4. Maybe we'll just get a little start in this for tonight. Yeah, on page 53. In Buddhist countries, the awakening is thought to have occurred on a single night of the full moon of the lunar month Vesakha, April and May, as the Buddha sat beneath a huge Bodhi tree, Ficus religiosus, the religious fig tree, don't you love it? With the awakening, Sambodhi, the Buddha attained, first, a knowledge of the nature of the human condition that would lead to salvation, and second, the certainty that he himself had attained liberation from the sorrows of that condition. The early scriptures attribute many doctrines, and certainly the most important ones, to the night of the awakening itself, so that the awakening is made to bear the weight of the whole of the Buddha's mature teaching. Even if this is not literally true, the knowledge and certainty of that night must lie at the base of the mature teaching. And of course, this is true in our own experience. I mean, people we know, you look back in your life and you see sometimes what in an outer sense, someone else would have thought is just like an insignificant kind of moment. And yet there can be some sort of spark and, certainty beyond certainty there. It's like you discover something that is true, that is valid. And that can change lifetimes, but certainly it changes one's stream of thought, because even though the same kind of distractions, delusions, and all these things just continue to go on, there's such a momentum, inertia in the sense of momentum going on. Still, there's been some difference. There's been some crack in the absolute reality of that. You've seen into the unreality of it. Rather, you've seen into the conditioned nature of it, that it's not on itself absolute. So this is wonderful, and this is very believable to me, that everything hinges on the Buddha's awakening, because whatever happened to him that night, he had an unbelievable vibe, unbelievable certainty. And it wasn't the certainty of like a fundamentalist who's just like shouting some conceptual belief again and again and again and denying things in order to, sort of bolster their chosen belief. But rather, this came out of the Buddha analyzing everything. He had destroyed everything with the razor sharpness of his mind. All the kind of false beliefs that we do, or even good beliefs that we do. And so therefore there was nothing there that could be falsified. And that accounts, I think, for his great confidence and the vibe that inspired people so greatly. I mean, it's amazing to think of, the movement, the social movement that came out of his teachings. How do you do that? The awakening grew out of a creative tension between two governing convictions. One was that the answer was to be sought in painstaking attention to the minutiae of experience as witnessed in insight meditation, though the articulated method of that meditation may not yet have been fully formed. But if this consideration alone had informed the Buddha, he might have become only a minor contributor to yogic thought. The other conviction, however, was that of the truth of transmigration, and the Buddha's conception of this gave his teaching a scope and a purchasing power in human life which transcended the narrow yogic concerns. The Buddha's originality stemmed from his close analysis of individual experience, but his importance stemmed from his acceptance of the common Indian belief in rebirth. In the Buddha's case, this belief came down to a deep moral seriousness. In other teachings, the doctrine of transmigration went with an elaborate view of the spiritual cosmos within which transmigration occurs. One moves up and down, becoming now an animal, now a god, now the denizen of some hell, and again a warrior or Brahmin, a slave or a king. Buddhism itself was later to be prolific in the production of such views. But for the Buddha, the specific details of transmigration were never so important as the principle underlying it. Human action has moral consequences. consequences which are inescapable, returning upon one, whether in this life or another. There is a fundamental moral order. One cannot steal, lie, commit adultery, or go along the banks of the Ganges, striking, slaying, mutilating, and commanding others to mutilate, oppressing, and commanding others to oppress, unquote, without reaping the consequences. There is an impersonal, moral causation to which all are subjected. Misdeeds lead to misery in this life or in later lives. The Buddha's teaching was devoted to the apparently selfish purpose of self-liberation, being directed to sentient beings insofar as they are capable of misery and final liberation from misery. But the teachings also touched sentient beings as moral agents, as agents capable of affecting the welfare not only of themselves, but of others as well. Some of his teachings seem to treat only personal liberation, others morality, but for the Buddha, the two matters were always intimately and necessarily connected. And actually, in this teaching on self-liberation, by bringing in the moral aspects, which obviously, moral because it affects others, you kind of see the germ of the Mahayana. And, the rise of the Mahayana is a totally other story, so to speak. How did it happen? And we do know that in the monasteries, this is later on, like 200 years later after the Buddha passed away, there weren't like Mahayana monasteries and self-liberation monasteries. Rather, you had individual practitioners. You'd have all these monks or nuns if it was a nunnery, and one of them would just be doing Mahayana teachings, and someone else is maybe just doing the straight self-liberation teachings. So it's a very interesting thing, but you see in the teaching itself this inclusion of everything and everyone. It was never this means of just becoming self-liberated yourself and, I'm okay, heck with those other people, or just ignorance, ignoring them, not caring about them. So it's believed that the Mahayana actually Mahayanists believe, is the original teaching of the Buddha, but expanded in this this kind of elaborate kind of way. Yeah, Keen, you want the mic?
You just had me thinking it would be interesting if you had, the Zen practitioners, maybe some Indian Buddhists, and Vajrayana, Tibetan, all together, because that instead we have separate places that we practice it.
Yeah, different traditions in that. Yeah. The good thing is that all roads lead to Rome.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
And truly, the genius of it is that it works with people's kind of inclinations, and that's a wonderful thing. But it shows you the weightiness, you might say, of the work itself, because it's as it's not just joining a certain style or something, but it's the work that goes on within there, and all these things in these different traditions support the kind of effort that they're promoting. So they take, it's said in China, for instance, they said that the monasteries, there are temple complexes originally, had like one temple over here, which would be, Pure Land, one over here, which was Abhidharma, one over here. So they had these different masters that were expert in their own thing. And they were all in this one big complex. So that's wonderful. But, someone's onto a certain style of practice, you want to take that to the end. And so that's all a good thing. That's all a good thing. But at the same time, I think there's something helpful to having that kind of specialization and separation, because truly different strokes for different folks. I was so amazed when, Gretchen and I, without intending it, stumbled into the Vajrayana. My first retreats with Lama Tarchin, it was like I had all these kind of Western Zen habits, and it's like people were doing things wrong. I mentioned to Rachel the other day, how you get fixed on your own stuff. And this is not a spiritual story, but when we were in India, we were catching a bus to Ajanta, and we were out in, a rural part of India in a bus station, and they had different, gates where you caught a different bus. So they had them numbered. But they had them numbered not with the Arabic numerals that we know, but with the Sanskrit numerals, which I think is where the Arabs actually first got there. I mean, they developed our modern numbering system, or the Arabs developed that. But there are a lot of similarities with the Sanskrit, but I think the Sanskrit was older. But nonetheless, my reaction, here Gretchen and I on our pilgrimage, right? My reaction was I saw these different numerals, was I got angry. They aren't using the real numerals. I could figure it out which door it was, so I was going to catch the right bus. Although when we got on the bus, it was the wrong bus anyway. That's India. No. We're sitting there, standing out like, the Ingies, there we were sitting on the bus waiting, no driver around waiting for it to, and then suddenly some kind Indian lady on the bus would come up to us and say, "This is not the bus to Ajanta." We went through 3 buses before we were on the right one. But nonetheless, it was so interesting to me. I got pissed off because they were using the wrong numerals. So that's what we do as human beings, You find something that's working for you, and let's make everybody do it. So I can feel good about myself. Mine's the best.
Isn't that part of pilgrimage? Like,
Yes.
I mean,
Thank you, Pat.
it
Yes.
shows you, like,
Yes.
it's the same kind of thing. I remember going up Vulture Peak Mountain and being exhausted
Uh-huh.
and having an asthma attack.
Yeah.
I am never gonna make it to the top.
Right. Pat's sharing this is the value of a pilgrimage. You're thrown into situations that you weren't planning on, and she had an asthma attack going up Vulture Peak. But also,
She wanted to be there.
yeah. Well, that's it. Yeah, that's it.
I got an asthma attack. I'm out of here.
No, I know that.
All right. One other ridiculous story, not really spiritual, but gives you an appreciation for how we love and hate India. So Gretchen and I were in India, and we were trying to get out because we had changed our itinerary. We didn't have reservations, and it was just so tricky. So eventually, we were in some sort of a travel agency or something, and this time we had 2 months experience of India, and there was this American in front of us who was arguing with the travel agent. He's having some sort of difficulty, and behind him, and I'm sitting there behind just watching this whole scenario and been through enough with India now. No, you weren't going to get anywhere by arguing, and this is just how it is. But behind on the wall, the traffic, you look behind the travel agent, there was this beautiful poster about Goa and said, "Enjoy the beautiful sands of Goa." But of course, when you go to Goa, there's like people are shitting on the beach, It was like, and I just thought, this poor guy in front of me, he had been seduced by some poster that made it seem like you were going to the Caribbean or something, or Miami Beach. And then he got there, and it was India. But that was the wonder of India. It's totally human. It's totally human, and you have to drop all of that expectations and all of that stuff. So when we left, we finally, I don't know how, we finally got on a plane after rummaging around for a week, just total frustration. And we were on the runway, and we both ordered a drink. And as we're barreling down for the takeoff, I started weeping because we were leaving India. So you can't even hate it when you think you should, All right.
I had that same feeling about, looking at that poster about
Yeah.
the beach and everything. We had been reading all the books about, the Ganges.
Mhm.
It was such a holy river.
Mhm.
And to get
It
there,
is, it's wholly inclusive of the
That's right. It is holy.
There's like all kinds of dead bodies floating around, and, there was a dead cow in there.
Right.
The monkey stole my offering that I was supposed to put in the water. He didn't tell me about that.
There you go. There you go. Okay. Let's dedicate this evening. We dedicate the merit from this evening's study and sharing and learning and questioning for the liberation of all. May each and every one of us never stop until each and every one of us is free. Svaha. Okay, thank you all. This is a lot of fun. Welcome back, Rachel. Good to see you back in the saddle, so to speak. I don't know. Right.